Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eyal de Lara, and I'm a professor and I'm the chair of the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto. It is my pleasure to welcome you all in here today, those that are here in person, as well as those that are joining us online this evening to this talk, which is part of the C.C. Kelly Gotlieb Distinguished Lecture Series. This series is a premier series of the Computer Science Department, and it's named after our inaugural department chair, Professor Kelly Gotlieb, who pushed U of T to the forefront of computer science in Canada and is credited with being largely responsible for leading Canadians into the modern age of computing. For more than a decade, this series has welcomed top minds to the Computer Science Department and to Toronto to discuss the research in the field. This academic year is a special one. We're actually celebrating the 60 years anniversary of the founding of our department on July 1st, 1964. Over the past 6 decades, U of T's Department of Computer Science has made tremendous strides in strengthening and advancing the field of computer science in Canada and globally. And this year is an opportunity to celebrate that impact and the promise that the future holds. So with events like this, we commemorate 60 years of computer science innovation and excellence, and I'm thrilled to have you join us as part of this celebration. This year, Distinguished Lecture Series lineup has drawn on some deeply talented researchers in our own faculty community, as well as some of our former faculty and alumni. This special event, this is really only the second evening event that we organize in our history, includes a special speaker, one of our former colleagues, Hertzmann, who's really a testament to the innovation and talent that has come out of the U of T computer science community. With that, I want to hand the mic over to Professor Kyros Koutoulakos, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Okay, so it's a really great pleasure to welcome Aaron Hertzmann, a friend and a former colleague, back to Toronto. So Aaron got his PhD in 2001 from New York University, and after spending a couple of years at UW, joined the faculty here in 2003 and stayed until 2013 or 14, I guess. And since then, he has been at Adobe and now is a principal scientist. Aaron has made foundational contributions in a number of different areas. He was one of the leading researchers at the intersection of machine learning, computer vision, and computer graphics for the entire period he was here. He did work in computational photography, in modeling human locomotion for animation purposes. He has, and more than anything else, over all of these years, his work has been influenced a lot by art. So he actually received a bachelor's degree in computer science and art. He he has made significant contributions in the area of non-photorealistic rendering, being one of the essentially founders of that field. And he has continued to work in that area ever since, in various ways. He has been done a significant work in understanding how to illustrate smooth surfaces, how to understand contours, and more recently, he has done he has been a great thinker in the connection between art and computer art and computer science. He is an artist himself, I've been enjoying seeing a lot of his drawings that he does on his tablet now for probably more than 10 years. We should, yeah, please, let's all welcome Aaron Hertzmann.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the generous introduction, and I'm really honored and grateful to be invited back. It's so much fun to be back here. And just as Kiros mentioned, a little bit about myself. My undergrad training is in painting and drawing and computer science, so a lot of my research throughout my career has been informed by that background in painting and drawing. And so, for example, in my PhD, I developed a system where it generates paintings, you stand in front of it, and the painting keeps updated as you watch it. And we showed this in some art festivals in New York in 2001. Maybe a little hard to see on the screen, but maybe the sun will go down. So in this talk, I want to talk about the relationship of computers and art. And so let's adjust the microphone volume a little bit. So I really trace the current evolution of, sorry, I just want to check one thing. I feel like, yep, I am playing the wrong slides. Okay, switching talks here. Okay, we rewind a little bit. Okay, so now we're on the right talk, right slate of slides. So again, here's the art installation. And I just want to mention that as Kiros mentioned, I still paint and draw. So like in the past few days, it's been fun being back in Toronto and coming here and visiting familiar old sites. And the weather was not so great when I first got here. But it's still fun to visit old places, and the weather today was much nicer. So in the past decade, there's been this real whirlwind of AI-driven art and lots of discussions happening around the interaction between these things. And I trace it back to about 10 years ago as sort of like the current wave with a deep dream, which was kind of fun for a few minutes, and people started talking about inception networks as if they're dreaming. And neural style transfer became very popular for a little while, and everyone was changing their social media profiles with Van Gogh style filters. And very quickly, these things were started to be shown in art contexts. This is from an installation from a gallery show in 2016 near where I live that was hosted by Google, showing deep dream and neural style transfer installations. And the audio in this file was not working recently. Let's double check. Yeah, okay, so, what you would be hearing if the audio was working here is, the people are satirizing the idea that computers are making art. And then 6 months later, a work was auctioned at Sotheby's for €500,000 euros. It was made with GANs, and it was signed with a loss function for GAN training. A few years later, text-to-image came along. So this is the early VQ GAN system where you could type in some text and run your Python notebook, and out what images would come. And not long after that, OpenAI released DALL-E, where you can type in text prompts into a web interface, and lots of pictures would come out. And since then, things have gone crazy, as I'm sure you know. Now, throughout all this time, people are making strong claims about the role of the algorithms. So for example, there's a paper from 2017 called Creative Adversarial Networks, which has a really interesting idea of choosing latent style vectors far from the training data. But what they claim in their abstract is we propose a system for generating art. The system generates art by looking at art and learning about style and becomes creative. And these very strong statements about what the algorithm does appear in the news media as this was picked up by journalists. Artificially intelligent painters invent new styles of art. AI artist creates its own painting style, and critics prefer some of its work to human efforts. So the agency is already being given to this piece of code that you would git pull and run. And here's Jerry Saltz, who is preeminent art critic from New York Magazine, talking about that system. And the thing to notice here is the agency that he assigns.
Initial thoughts, incredibly dull, generic, boring. The programmers are not freeing up the program. I want the robot to tap into its inner robot. Be free.
So it's hard to tell if this is serious, but it's already assumed this thing is just not a very good artist. So that's the question I want to talk about here. Can computers create art? And I sort of see two general takes out in the world about this. One is that it's just a matter of technological capability. if the pictures that the algorithm makes are good enough, that makes the algorithm an artist. Or conversely, that art requires some human-like element, it's a human activity and something that cannot be automated. And this view is one I'm sympathetic to, but it's sort of hard to articulate in sort of the right way, and that's sort of what I want to try to do in this talk. So the main points I want to make here are that software offers technologies for people to make art. All of these different algorithms are technologies. And so when you make an image with an algorithm, the user, are the artist. Computers themselves should not be considered artists, and I'll describe the reasons why I think this is harmful. I think the way that we make art and the way we think about art is really going to change. It is undergoing a lot of significant changes, and I'll explain that. And really, to understand where these things are going, these changes are really complex and hard to predict. And I think there's a lot of lessons from history that are really useful for understanding just how much things can change and the way they could change and the way they are not likely to. Now, as you know, there's lots of controversy in this space. I'm not going to address all of them or make recommendations for what we should be doing. But my goal here is really to provide useful ways to think about how art interacts with technology and how technology changes the way we understand and think about art. And I think these are useful bits of information to have when having these discussions. So let's get into some of the history. And the first point I want to make is that technology has transformed art many times in the past, and transformed not just what it is or how we make it, but what we think art is. So in the 15th century, with the development of oil paint by Van Eyck, it allowed much greater tone and visual richness as compared to the previous technology of fresco. It's easier, more practical. And even then, of course, Michelangelo looked down on it. He said, it's just for amateurs. In the centuries that followed, within the Western tradition, there was one thread of work towards making paintings that are more and more visually realistic. And by the 19th century, Western painters were able to make things that look really visually dazzling and real. And I think for those of us living in the modern era, this is a little bit hard to appreciate how different the understanding of art was. That today, we are surrounded by pictures and photographs and video and everywhere. But if you were living in 1850, to see a picture like this would have been a very unique and special thing. It's something that can only happen when you see the work of a highly talented and skilled artist. And so being an artist is very highly tied into the ability to make pictures like this. That is, in the Romantic era, what they thought an artist was. So the threat to that comes with the development of photography. Here's what's considered to be the very first known photo in history. And the early people who made photographers. They were tinkerers. They were just people playing around with chemicals and optics. Here was the first Instagram of someone's meal. This picture is the first picture by Daguerre, which shows somebody standing still, a person. He took the picture looking out of his window, and you can see in the lower left, my cursor is not going over there, but there's a person who looks like he's having his shoes shined. It's like a 10-minute exposure, so the reason he stood still is that he was having his shoes shined. Here's the first selfie from 1838. So this work was originally just people playing around with the toys, but it really became accessible to the public when Daguerre publicly announced and described his technique so that in principle, other people could use it. And he chose not to patent it because the French government bought him out. They paid him because they thought that this invention was so valuable that it should be made freely available without patents. And in the very first exhibition, or the first exhibitions of photography, classical painter Paul Delaroche says, "From today, painting is dead." Because here's a technology that seems to automate what artists do. Artists are people who make realistic pictures. This machine does that. The great Turner said, "This is the end of art. I'm glad I've had my day." So what happened? Well, painting is used for many different things. One purpose of it is for portraiture. So in 1838, if you wanted to have a picture made of yourself, you could sit for a painting. You had to be quite wealthy to do that. If you're not as wealthy, you might have a silhouette picture made. And obviously, this is not as good as the full portrait painting, but that's complicated, expensive, and slow. So within a few decades, photography really displaced portraiture studios. So you would go in and sit for a portrait, and you would sit, brace your head and brace your arms and sit still for 10 minutes during the exposure. And as a result of all of that, we now have, from, for example, this great photographer Nadar, all these wonderful portraits of 19th century figures, such as the photographer Matthew Brady here. And so portrait painters were really displaced. One portrait painter wrote by 1863, "One knows that photography has harmed painting considerably and killed portraiture, once the livelihood of the artist." So these artists' jobs were replaced by photography. And really a lot of portrait artists ended up retraining and learning the skill of portrait photography. In the high art discussion, there was a discussion for many, many decades, is photography art? On one hand, the tinkerers, the explorers, keep playing around with it and just seeing what does it mean to make pictures with this new technology. Like many new art technologies, one of the first things they did was try to mimic the old styles. So this is a visual style called pictorialism in photography, which is composed from multiple exposures and creating sort of classical tableau and classical themes, very much in the style of the way classical painting worked at the time, this sort of horizontal tableau of different elements. There's much more of a history there, but within a few decades, the artists, photographers were able to develop a new technology that, developed the art form using photography that became recognized by major museums and galleries. It became accepted into the fine art world and recognized as an art form. Now in this time, on the other hand, there were the haters. Here's Charles Baudelaire in his review of the Salon of 1859. "If photography is allowed to stand in for art, it will corrupt it completely, thanks to the stupidity of the multitude." Us, presumably. So here he is saying photography is going to kill art because it is a worse form of the same thing. But it also spurred artists to do different things. So Whistler, who's most famous for the picture of his mother, he wrote that the imitator is a poor kind of creature. If the man who paints only the surface he sees before him were the artist, the king of artists would be the photographer. It is for the artist to do something beyond this. So he's saying, actually, photography isn't just about making realistic pictures, it's about something more. And Van Gogh takes this further. In this letter to his brother in his pivotal year of 1888, he wrote, "Accurate drawing is not the essential thing to aim at because the reflection of reality in a mirror would not be a picture at all, no more than a photograph." So actually, now realistic painting isn't even art anymore, is what he's saying. And then in a few decades, I won't read the whole quote, but the Dadaists, the modern artists were basically saying, well, because of photography, actually the old way we used to think about painting is over, and now we have something new happening. So just to summarize that whole history of photography, it looks like photography automates art. It does the thing that artists do. And many artists feared it and disparaged it. What actually happened is we have a new art form, photography, which is quite distinct from painting. The old art forms were invigorated. I would claim that we only have a modern art movement because of photography, or photography was one of the main causes of the whole modern art movement of the 20th century. Jobs for portrait artists were highly affected. There was a lot of displacement there. And one other thing which I haven't mentioned so far is that image creation is made much more accessible to hobbyists. So people, by the 20th century, lots of people can make pictures just by photography. Consumer photography is widespread, and now we're all carrying cameras around with us all the time in ways that, we can now make pictures in ways that we couldn't have 200 years ago. Now, there's a lot of complicated things that happen here, and one of my main claims here is that versions of these different trends have repeated over and over again with all sorts of different new technologies for making art. In different ways to various different degrees, but these are all very common themes. Now, in the modern art movement that grew, I think was spurred by photography, there's really this notion of like whatever the artist does can be art. So this is the famous fountain by Duchamp, where he took a urinal out of some old sail, submitted it to an art salon, it was rejected, and this is now one of the most famous works of art in the 20th century. He just took a urinal and signed his name to it. For the rest of this discussion now, I would say that I take a very broad notion of what can be art: painting, conceptual art, like I just showed you, music, dance, movies, theaters, and so on. Video games are art. It's, as I'll mention, I'll discuss this a little more later, but it's just not interesting to say what is not art and what is not art. Following from Duchamp's fountain, another important work in the development of conceptual art is Sol LeWitt's wall paintings. And the way that these paintings are made is he writes down a list of instructions. These are in the 1950s, I believe. He writes down a list of instructions, and then other people paint the wall according to his instructions. He sort of says, draw a line here, draw a line there, use this color there, and so on. And in his theses on conceptual art, he wrote, the artwork is a machine, the idea is a machine that generates the art. And so you can see this is an early precursor of computer art, that the artist here is not actually painting the strokes, the artist is giving the instructions to paint the strokes. Within a few decades, we started to be able to make art with computers. So from the very beginning, the 1960s, here are a few examples of people who were able to use just a very early, they don't have screens or anything, they're able to write pieces of code that generate artworks. I just have one example from Leslie Massé, the founder of the U of T graphics group. Not his maybe best work, but the one I found quickly online. So one of the most important AI artists of the 20th century is Harold Cohen. He started out, he went to one of the main fine art schools. He went to Slade, and he was doing conceptual art. And his original process out of art school was he would set a bunch of rules for himself, and he would paint oil on paper following those rules, and this pattern would emerge out of that. Then he discovered Fortran, and he's like, why am I doing this by hand? I can just write code. And he wrote, for the rest of his career, he wrote code that made art, and this is collected by a lot of major galleries and museums. And I'll come back to talk more about his work later. People were started to do computer painting. And there's all this stuff throughout the 20th century evolutionary work where these abstract patterns are evolved through user feedback when people upvoting and downvoting different generations, and then they evolve by mutation processes. And more popular art is computer animation, which is really arose, especially at Pixar, through a close collaboration of artists and animators. So for example, Alvy Ray Smith, who's one of the co-founders of Pixar, said that before they founded Pixar, they would go down to Disney and try to convince Disney to adopt computer tools. And the animators, he says, were frightened of the computer. They felt it was going to take their jobs away, and they spent a lot of time telling people it's just a tool, it doesn't do the creativity. And if you've ever tried to use classic computer animation tools, this is not easy. Like, animators are people who are incredibly talented and skilled at turning these, turning a bunch of numbers into lifelike motion. And the mantra of early Pixar days was art challenges technology and technology inspires art. And now, of course, if you look at the credits of any animated movie, and also a lot of visual effects movies that are supposedly live action but are just tons and tons of effects, the number of people employed there is just staggering. In my own work, which began in the late 90s, I developed techniques for making paintings from photographs and line drawings with 3D models. So the picture on the right there is basically the output of code that I wrote that takes a photograph on the left as input. And even though the algorithm makes all the paint strokes, you can read the paper and you can see how every decision is being made. And this is the work that I showed at the beginning of the talk, which is generating paintings as you stand in front of it. At some point I realized actually it's kind of a pain. It was really hard to design algorithms that make nice paintings, and so I decided to do it from an example. And so in 2001 I published a technique in which we learn the style of a painting, or in this case a pastel illustration, and then transfer it to a target picture. And so again, even though all of the decisions about which pixel colors go where are in the algorithm, you can read the paper and understand the decision-making process. And artists who work with various computer techniques really view it as a tool quite often. So this is the words of Helena Sarin, one of my favorite AI artists, where this is when she was using GANs about 4 or 5 years ago, or actually it looks like quite a while ago. And she really makes the analogy to watercolor painting. So if you've ever tried painting with watercolor, it feels like it has a mind of its own. And you have to figure out how to work with watercolor. And that's the way she describes making art with GANs as well. At the same time, of course, there's all the discussion, like, this robot paints, is it art? And this has been happening every single decade for, ever since the 1960s. 1986, computer art, is it really art? And here they're talking about the Andy Warhol Mac Paint kind of illustrations I showed earlier. So, what to summarize all these things I've just shown you, for the past 60 years, people have been making art with computers. Other people ask the same questions over and over again. You made art with a computer. Is it really art? Is the computer the artist? The answer has always been the same for the past 60 years. The computer is a tool that people are using to make art. All of this computer art is handmade. Now, I've given this talk a bunch of times, and I'm always updating it, revising it, of course. But one thing I often hear from people, and you see this in a lot of the public discussions, is that being an artist is just a matter of making good pictures. That if an algorithm makes good pictures, that makes it the artist.
Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?
Can you?
So, counterpoint there. So, it's really tempting to do. It's really tempting to think, okay, all I have to do is make an algorithm which has whatever properties an artist has, and then I have the algorithm as an artist. But when you actually try to do that, you start to realize, it's all just code. So let's look at Harold Cohen, who I mentioned earlier as being like one of the major computer artists of the 20th century. And here's his evolution in that process.
10 years after that, I would have said, look, the program is doing this on its own. Another 10 years on, and I would have said, the fact that the program is doing this on its own is the central issue here. It was producing complex images of a high quality, and I could have had it go on forever without rewriting a single line of code. How much more autonomous than that can one get?
So he has code, he runs the code, and it produces work that's hanging in galleries and museums and being sold to collectors. Sounds like an artist.
Well, of course, that's exactly the point. It's virtually impossible to imagine a human being in a similar position. The human artist is modified in the act of making art. For the program to have been similarly self-modifying would have required not merely that it be capable of assessing its own output, but that it had its own modifiable worldview to provide a basis for any meaningful assessment.
So this is a set of steps that I think is, one goes through. You think, I made a computer that generates images, that makes it an artist. I think, well, it's missing something. In his case, he says it doesn't have a modifiable worldview. So imagine adding it. If you add that, would that make it an artist? But it's still, it's a bunch of code you wrote. And the thing is, we've had, by any definition of art that is focused on the qualities of the output, there are algorithms that do that. So for example, here's the Mandelbrot set that when it first came out, I think it was in the 80s, it was just dazzling. And you can watch this thing for a really long time. And it's surprising and novel. Those are some, people sometimes define creativity in making things that are surprising and novel and aesthetically valuable in some way. This is that. And yet, the Mandelbrot set is essentially 10 lines of code. You can summarize it with a single equation. It's chaotic, which means you can't predict it. It can produce lots of random seeming patterns. And so code that is very simple can produce stuff that really satisfies a lot of definitions of art. And anything you write that has some random number generators and some complicated behaviors is going to essentially be unpredictable, and essentially produce surprising things once in a while, things that feel creative. So in short, if to this view that if an AI makes good pictures as an artist, I would say we have 150 years history of people with machines making art, whether photography, computer animation, and so on. And yet in all these cases, we still view the computers as tools after we have understood the technology for a while. So again, all the current computer-generated art is human-made. And even if you write text into a prompt and a bunch of images come out, there's a lot of complicated, relationships. Different people are involved in making this in different ways, just in the way a lot of different people are involved in making a movie. But in the end, this is a human process. And to the question of whether these things are art, I would say, of course it is. It's just not, I feel like if you were having the discussion about whether something is art, just say yes. And because that discussion is almost always a waste of time. The thing which is really worth discussing about any work is, does it create emotional connection? Does it have meaning? Is it original? Is the work ethical? Is it honest about what it is? Is it aesthetically valuable? These are meaningful discussions to have and really worthwhile discussions to be having about any technology people are using. Often I talk to people who believe that it doesn't matter where a work came from, that the pixels, as long as the pixels are good, that's the only thing that matters. And I would really argue that the source of where something came from, how it was made, or what you believe about how it was made, really affects the way that you perceive and understand the work. So for example, if I were to tell you this picture was made by typing text prompt into Gotlieb, or if I was to tell you that I painted it by hand, on a canvas, I think those two different stories I tell would give you a very different feeling about what the work means and what you think of it. In actuality, this is something that I did paint on my tablet, but I painted it working from a photograph, so maybe that changes your impression of it a little bit. It's actually a picture of a dog that I walk in the shelter, and it's, there's kind of a long, sad story about this dog. So if I were to tell you that story, which I'm not, I think that would also change the meaning of the work quite a bit as well. That it's just not just some random picture you saw on the internet. Now, at the same time all this is happening, in parallel, we're having all of the AI hype that you all know about. From the 1958 development of the perceptron, in the New York Times, it says the Navy will be, has revealed a new thing that will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. This is the description of the perceptron by Larry Rosenblatt, which is a linear classifier before backpropagation. So basically, it's a column in an Excel spreadsheet. There's so many examples of this hype, the computer design this week's cover, and so on and so on. And I think that the hype is really harmful. It speaks to the fictional narratives we have of AI that, in our entertainment, movies and TV and video games, where we see so many AIs and robots who are essentially human-like, but with a twist. And so the message is that AI is a real thing, when in fact, really, most of what we're calling AI these days is just large, fitting incredibly complicated functions to very large data sets, but essentially data fit with some procedural code and lots of prompt engineering around it. And we as humans have such a strong propensity to view hard to understand animate systems as if they're alive. So you probably know about the ELIZA system from the 70s, where people would start chatting with it. It's written in the style of a Rogerian psychotherapist, and people started having emotional interactions with it and start to see it as a real thing, even though it's simple set of a rule system written in the 1970s. So I think it's really dangerous actually to describe computers as artists, because that means that people are going to interpret the system as though it's person-like, because artists are people, and humans should really have responsibility for these systems, and there's lots of harms to treating AI systems as actually intelligent. So like in the words of Cory Doctorow, AI can't do your job, but an AI salesman can convince your boss to fire you and replace you with a chatbot. And we're seeing so many examples of AI systems replacing human agency and then having lots of harmful impacts on people's lives. So that's the discussion of the state of things as we are today. We have these great, interesting tools for making art. They are really changing a lot in the past few years. But there's also an interesting question to ask, will this ever change? Will there be a point in the future in which computers will be artists? Will we and that we will together agree that the computers are the artists? And I want to propose an answer to this question, which is based on an idea, which is I claim that art is a social behavior. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So we are evolved as social animals, and we have lots of behaviors that are social. So for example, gifts and marriage and fashion. So take fashion, for example. We wear clothes to project ourselves in the element, but the clothes that we choose to wear are really based on our social relationships with other people, expressions of who we are in relationships and so on. So these are really, these are examples of social behaviors. And art is one as well. When we make art, we share it with other people, we see it with other people, we talk about it in groups, we teach it to the next generation, use it to communicate values, we buy it, sometimes very publicly, and then show it off to display our values and our taste and our wealth. And all of these are the social behaviors we have around how we make use of art. And I'm really inspired by this book by Dennis Dutton, the philosopher, who gives a lot of evidence to think that art is really an evolved social behavior. It's part of our evolutionary history, and I claim we make it for social reasons. Now, when I make this claim, often someone says, well, I just make art for myself. Does that disprove the point? And my point is not that, I think art has lots of value, drawing pictures as very meditative and so on. But that doesn't mean that that's the purpose of art evolutionarily. We have lots of behaviors that we do that are pleasurable and beneficial for their own sake, but evolved for a social function or for some other function. So for example, I would say that language evolved for the purposes of communication with other people, but still, it's, I write notes for myself, I sing in the shower or whatever. Those are all solo activities, but the purpose of the thing is the social behavior. And I think art is the same. We evolved to make art as part of our social relationships with other people. So in short, I think we care about other people. Other people are very important to us. And I believe only people can make art, and computers are not people. And there's a few other examples we can look at. Animals there are many social animals that we have social relationships with. And in principle, if they cared about aesthetics and cared about art artifacts, then I think we would totally accept them as being artists. Conversely, we don't often think of natural processes as artists. You can, coastlines and flowers and the heavens can all have a lot of the traditional properties of art, of being beautiful, changing your perspective, emotionally moving, and yet we don't think of the nature that having process as an artist in the same way we think of as human artists. In general, like I've mentioned, we have so many mechanical processes that are like these natural processes. They don't have their own agency or autonomy, and so we don't think of them as being artists. So that gives us a possible answer for the question of when could it be that a computer would be an artist. So if we achieve consciousness and human-level AI, then yes, of course, these things would be considered artists, but this is science fiction. It's something that might never happen. We don't know this is ever a possibility. Maybe, but it's definitely not on the horizon. Now, there's this sort of in-between case of social and conversational AIs, like chatbots and Siri and Alexa and parotherapeutic seals, sort of things that we have sort of social-ish interactions with. But I think when we either see them as things, or we have, if we actually saw them as real people and then found out what they are, we often feel cheated. So I think as long as there's honesty about the nature of these algorithms, then I don't think we would see them as artists. And it's only if there's some deception involved that this chatbot is actually intelligent that we might be deceived. Now, all of the other software we make is not social, and as long as you know a little bit about how it works, that you're not being deceived about what's going on under the hood, I just don't see how we can see these things as being artists. These are things that people wrote, people use, people run, and so on. Now, often when I give this talk, I also hear someone says, there's always someone who says, we are just computers, the brain is a computer, or a version of this is that we can simulate the whole use of the computer, the whole universe in the computer. Therefore, this proves that computers can be artists. And I think these things are probably true, but it's all speculation and science fiction. We're really not at the point of having the science of understanding human consciousness and human personhood is pre-paradigmatic. We just don't know enough to be able to say what that means. And so, if we want to have a conversation about the computers of today or the computers of the foreseeable future, then we're talking about laptops and GPUs, and these things are just things. They are not people. And so, since this often comes up, if you're the person that says that a computer should be able to make art because people are just computers, so here's a picture of me adopting my dog a few weeks ago, and I would say that if you think a computer is, if you say that, then you're essentially saying that computers are morally, socially, ethically, legally equivalent to people in some sense. That if harming a person should be considered morally equivalent in some way to harming a laptop. And yet, when I'm done with a laptop, I recycle it, maybe it gets destroyed or something. No one sees anything particularly wrong with that. If I was done with my dog and did the same thing, that would be horrible. So I think there's a really important distinction between people, dogs, and computers that we don't have the science to be able to articulate what that is, but there is a really important difference. So again, we care about people, only people make art, and computers are not people. Now that being said, okay, so that's about the notion of, with all of that background, the effects of the technology on art are very complicated. And so again, I just have a few things to say about this. One quote I really like by Melvin Kranzberg, the historian, is technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It's not that stuff is good or bad, but it can be good or bad in very different contexts in ways that are very complicated. And his paper on Kranzberg's laws is a wonderful read, written many decades ago about a lot of the themes that I think are still relevant today. And I think it's really impossible to predict how a new technology will drive art. People are saying this stuff is going to kill art and stuff, but it's also going to enable new things. So for example, here's Les Paul, the main innovator of the electric solid body guitar. He played these nice show tunes and country music. He and nobody else could, I think, have predicted the way music would change as a result of the invention of the electric guitar and all the cultural impact it was going to have. You just can't know how the art is going to evolve. Here's a poster from the 1920s in which this is around the time when music recording was invented. So now you could buy a recording of music and listen to it at home and not have to pay musicians to perform. And this particular one was for when movies started to have audio soundtracks instead of having live musicians in the theaters. And they campaigned, this is one of these examples where they campaigned against the development of this technology for recorded music because it would take away jobs from performance musicians, and it did for a while. On the other hand, the development of recorded music had a lot of benefits and led itself to new technologies and new ways to make art. So, 50 or so years, 60 years later, with the development of hip hop, this is a technology that came about because of a combination of socioeconomic factors, but also this technology of having two records that you could scratch on and a fader between them. And now suddenly, one guy can be a DJ and make this entirely new form of art together with an MC. That resulted from this technology. So, how do we think about how do artists resist this? And I think one really positive example in a way is the Hollywood writers' strike, as well as the actors' strike that happened around the same time. And this was a result of the development of streaming technology. So there had been this long in TV and movie production, there's a sequence of new technologies. So first there was the development of syndicated television, and suddenly artists were getting a raw deal because they weren't getting royalties for all the syndicated TV shows. So they had a strike and negotiated new contracts. And then I'm skipping a few steps, but then streaming was invented, so we could all watch movies at home without having to order DVDs online. And again, this led to really bad contracts for artists. So that's what this writer's strike was about. Each new technology ended up giving more power to the people in charge, essentially, and they resisted it with a strike. In this particular last strike, AI was not a cause of the strike, but it was one of the big things they negotiated on. And so, there's all these new controversies happening all the time, and how we think about these it's really complicated, and who benefits and who is harmed and what new future technologies and art forms are affected as well. It's complicated to think about. So I have a few predictions to make. One is that the future AI tools are not going to look like what we have now. A lot of the debate and discussion is around text to image, where you type in a text prompt and a bunch of pictures come out of it. That is a fad. Most of that sucks. It's not really good art. But since 2022, when those things first came about, people already started working on new artistic control techniques. New papers are being published very regularly where you can author where this thing goes here and change it to that style and customize it for my dog or whatever, and adjust the video control. And so these techniques are going to add more and more artistic control and more ability for artists to control what they make and then make things better and better. Artists are going to find new ways to use these tools, and new genres and techniques will emerge from this experimentation. And also non-experts will have new ways to create images and communicate with each other. It also means many painful disruptions for art and artists, and I think it's really hard to be an artist right now, and so this feels like it just makes everything worse. So it's not clear what to do about it, but I think it'd be a very scary time for a lot of people right now. And as a result, that means there are many difficult ethical challenges in thinking about, and I think the right way to talk about it is not this thing is an artist or not an artist, it's really about who benefits from these new technologies or policies and who is harmed. I think sometimes people have a fear that these things are going to make art bad because it's too easy, but that's been the case for all kinds of new technologies. Every new technology has made art easier to produce, it's made it much easier to make bad art, but it's raised the bar. And so, the kind of movies we have today are in a way like really something far beyond what they had in cinema 60 years ago. And so we're always going to be sensitive as an audience. We will become sensitive to what the really good stuff is, and we're always going to want artists and care about the work that real artists make and not just flashy tech demos. So to summarize my main points here, this so-called AI is not a human-like person. It is not an artist. It is a technology for people to make art and for people to be creative, and with many analogies to other art-making technologies. A lot of similarities and trends to the previous technologies I've talked about. I think it can create lots of benefits. It can be very harmful in lots of ways. And just as photography completely changed the way that we think about art 100 years ago, I think that these new technologies are also going to significantly change the way we think about it today and the way that we make art. Thank you.